supporter of this council since before it was founded, actually. So our debt to them is not only for this evening, but continuing. I'd like to very quickly remind you of our next several guests. William E. Colby, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, will speak on the topic, Nuclear Arms, Can They Be Controlled, on the 9th of December. And His Excellency Moshe Renz, the Ambassador of Israel to the United States, will address the Council on the 13th of December. That meeting will be at the Hyatt Regency instead of in this room. And of course, Mr. Colby is not unfriendly to the nuclear freeze movement at this time. And in January, on January 6th, General Bessie, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, will address the Council. We're fortunate to introduce our speaker this evening, good friend of the Council, a longtime member of the Council, native Baltimorean, and former member of the Foreign Service, a former colleague and good friend of our guest this evening. And given that association, I think it particularly appropriate that Mr. David Ness introduce the Ambassador. Mr. Ness.
Thank you very much, Frank. I don't know how all of you feel about recent events in Lebanon, but based on media coverage and without any real historical perspective in depth, I myself have found many of the key elements there confusing, mysterious, and I have confessed my ignorance. Who are the Christians? How are they divided into sects? Will a minority Christian government succeed in stabilizing the country? Who are the Druze who are fighting there on the mountains? What are the objectives and intentions of the Syrians, of the Israelis? Looking back at recent Lebanese history, I do sense that many events have a direct bearing on what is going on there today. The period of the French protectorate following the First World War, the memoranda and maps and their references to Lebanon submitted by Chairman Weitzman at the Versailles Conference, the independence of Lebanon achieved during the Second World War with arrangements for government designed to satisfy the various religious communities in the country. The rebellion of 1958, where our Marines were involved. The Civil War in Jordan in 1970 and the additional influx of both civilian and guerrilla Palestinians in Lebanon at that time. The Israeli invasion of 1978 and the various ceasefires that followed. And finally, the Israeli campaigns of this past summer. All of these, I feel, have a bearing on what is going on today, but I'm sure that our speaker will greatly clarify them. If he doesn't, you can ask questions. Now, Dick Parker, as I always knew him, after 4 years as an infantry officer, and including being a prisoner of war in areas taken over by the Russians in East Germany. And I'm sure his account of his experience at that time would be just as enthralling as his talk on Lebanon this evening, but we'll leave that for another time. He came into our career foreign service in 1948 through competitive exams, which were somewhat more competitive then than they are now. And after some 34 years in the service, beginning with Australia, he culminated his career with 3 ambassadorships, which is somewhat of a record for our people, to Algeria, to Lebanon, and to Morocco. Since retirement, he's been on the campus of the University of Virginia. He is now editor of the Middle East Institute's journal. And without further limiting the time he's going to give us, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Richard Parker.
afraid you were going to give my speech before you stopped. This is quite a place to talk. I'm terribly distracted by the view out there. I'm sorry that you don't have one that nice to look at. I'm going to start this evening with a little bit of background about Lebanon, and a country that I've spent a good deal of time in. Starting with the geography. At the University of Virginia, when I would talk about, I taught a couple of courses on the Middle East, and I would start out saying that I really should begin with Adam and Eve, but we haven't got time. And I would start with Abraham. In the case of Lebanon, we can start with Abraham too, if you like, but I'm not going to go all that way back. I'm just going to say a few things about the geography and the recent history. The important thing to keep in mind about Lebanon is, first of all, its geography. Lebanon was historically Mount Lebanon, the mountain where the cedars of Lebanon were, the cedars that Hiram of Tyre supplied for the building of the temple. The mountain is followed by a valley, by another range of mountains, the Anti-Lebanon. This is the same terrain feature, the Great Rift Valley that runs down through Israel and Jordan down into Eastern Africa, East Africa. The Lebanon range is the highest of all these ranges. It is normally snow-capped in the wintertime. I remember an Englishman who won a bet that he could ski every month of the year on Mount Lebanon, and he won it because he found a little patch of snow in the shade up there that still had snow on it even in August. And this mountain is a classic refuge area where minorities have sought refuge. And there are two principal minorities that live there, the Maronites and the Druze. Now, the origins of the Maronites are debated, but they seem to be people who originally were subscribing to the monothelite heresy of the Emperor Heraclius. One of the heresies that involved revolved around the question of the nature of Christ. And this was a monothelite heresy was one nature and one will. The Maronites, at the time of the Arab invasion in the 7th century, moved up into these mountains, into a very rugged, very beautiful area around what we now call the Cedars. And this became their refuge. They lodged in the caves. They established their patriarchate up there, and this became their center. Like most mountain people, they developed a great deal of self-reliance and customs of combat. They were reckless mountain boys, like the Martins and the Coys, if you remember. And they took up family feuding when they met. And they've been feuding ever since. But they managed to maintain their independence. When the Crusaders came, they descended from the mountains and supplied archers to the Crusaders. And at least from that period, they became reconciled with Rome. From that date on, the Maronites have been a Uniate church, that is a Catholic church, even though they have maintained their own liturgy, and until fairly recently, the priesthood could marry, and so forth. The other minority that was found in this great mountain was the Druze. The Druze were an esoteric, or are an esoteric sect, an offshoot of Islam. They count themselves as Muslims. They're normally counted as Muslims in the census, but the other Muslims do not recognize them as such. They are closer to Orthodox Islam than the Alawites of Syria, but they are still too heterodox for the other Muslims. They have a secret religion, and it's obviously a compound of various beliefs. And they too, as a minority, sought refuge in this mountain and have defended themselves and also developed warlike qualities. For much of the historical period since the Middle Ages, they dominated the mountain. In the 16th, 17th centuries, the Maronites began moving south. The Maronites were in the northern part of this mountain, north of the Damascus Road. The Druze were south of it. The Maronites began migrating, particularly in the 18th century, and originally they were serfs of the Druze. But the Druze being the feudal masters of this area. In 1860, fighting broke out between them, and there was a great massacre of the Maronites, and the European powers intervened. And they imposed on Turkey a sort of protectorate over Mount Lebanon, under which the Turks appointed always a governor from outside of Lebanon, who was not a Muslim, an Armenian or a Greek Orthodox from Turkey, and his actions were closely followed by the European consuls. From this point, from 1860, there developed in Lebanon, particularly among the Christians, but also among the Druze, a reliance on outside powers to help them solve their problems. And the French became the patrons of the Maronites, the British the patrons of the Druze. The area south of the Damascus Road was where Protestant missionaries could go to proselytize. North of that, Catholic missionaries, French and British. The idea that they could play off the French and the British against each other was something that became ingrained in their attitudes. That plus the way the Turks divided them by communities, and you were governed according to your religion, not according to your nationality, gave rise to it did not already exist, it certainly would have encouraged a tribal outlook on the world. Your first loyalty is to your family, your second loyalty is to your sect, your third loyalty is to your village. Every village is divided into two factions, the big enders and the little enders. The people on one side of the tracks and the people on the other side of the tracks. And you always think in terms of protecting your family and your quarter of the village. At the end of World War I, the French and the British carved up the Middle East, as most of you know. The British got Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. The French got Syria and Lebanon. Now, throughout this period, the Maronites and the Druze were living up in the mountain. Down in the plains, in the coastal areas, were the Muslims, the Sunni Orthodox Muslims and the Shia or heterodox. And those people were governed separately by the Turks in a separate province, and they were not a factor in the mountain itself. When the French came, they redrew the map of Lebanon, and they included these Muslim areas on the coast, particularly Tripoli and Sidon and the Bekaa, the valley between Syria and Lebanon, thereby creating a state religion. Not only were there Maronites and Druze, but large Sunni and Shia communities. At that point, the Christians in this equation were probably the majority. And keep in mind that the Maronites are not the only Christians. There are more sects than you've ever heard of in Lebanon. In addition to the Maronites, there are the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Catholics, the Armenian Orthodox and the Armenian Catholics, the Syrian Catholics, the Chaldeans, the Protestants, the Latins, a total of 11 recognized sects. Recognized in the legal sense that they have a percentage of the government. The Christians today constitute about 35% of the population. The Maronites are the largest single element in this. They are about 20%. The Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholics, 10%. The Armenians, 5%. I differentiate between Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic. Greek Orthodox are people who are descendants, they're all descendants of the original Christians of this area. They have remained part of the Eastern Church. The Greek Catholics have been proselytized by the French and have become in union with Rome. Now, over against this today are 65% of the population, which is Muslim or Druze, 25% Sunni, 30% Shia, and 10% Druze. The French, however, in 1932, conducted a census, the results of which showed that the Christians were a majority in a ratio of 6 to 5. And this, the fiction that the Christians still exist in this majority is still part of the basic political fabric of this country. At the time of independence in 1943, they had something called the National Covenant, which was an unwritten agreement that they would maintain this fiction of this division of the population, and that the President of the Republic would always be a Maronite, the Prime Minister would always be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Parliament would always be a Shia Muslim. Not only that, they divided up the government, and something the French called the dosage, the rate. Jobs in the Lebanese government are determined by religion. That is, in addition to those I started at the top, the foreign minister should be a Greek Orthodox or Greek Catholic. The Minister of Defense should be Druze. The Lebanese ambassador in Paris should be Maronite. The Lebanese ambassador in Washington should be Sunni. He used to be Maronite, but this was changed in 1958, and now he has to be a Sunni Muslim. And one votes by confession. One votes in his district for X numbers of Maronites, X numbers of Sunnis, X numbers of Armenians. And you really haven't got any choice. You can't go out of this. And if you're not of the right religion, you don't get to run. Religion determines where one lives, who one marries, what one does, and where one is buried. One of my predecessor in Beirut back in the 60s, when I was political officer there, wrote a paper on this once, in which he had what I thought was a very nice statement, that Lebanon is a carefully elaborated device for obtaining an equilibrium between the major religious groupings. One could say, in paraphrase of Churchill, that it is a compromise wrapped in a tacit understanding and mounted on gimbals. Well, this system functioned. Everybody kept talking about Israel as the only democracy in the Near East. Well, there was another democracy, and that was Lebanon. It wasn't very efficient. It was corrupt. There was a good deal of anarchy. The Minister of Defense's son gets in a pistol fight with a taxi driver in the middle of town, and this is considered normal. Nobody pays his taxes, but things work. There's a story about an international economist brought out there to look at it, and he spent 3 weeks, and he came to the President of the Republic and said, I don't know what the hell you're doing here, but whatever it is, keep it up. They had a democratically elected parliament, which respected the Constitution. The President was elected by the parliament. He could not succeed himself. One of the reasons for the revolution in 1958 was the attempt of then President Camille Chamoun to succeed himself, to ignore the Constitution. The Constitution is sacred. One of the problems this September about the election was that they were already late. Bashir Gemayel was supposed to have been elected on a given day, and they didn't have a quorum. They postponed it only 1 week. There was no question but that they must have the election, because it was required. The former president could not succeed himself. The country had and still has the highest standard of living in the Arab world. There was a thing called the PQLI, the Physical Quality of Life Index, that is developed by the Office of the Overseas Development Council in Washington, which is based on literacy, infant mortality, death rate, life expectancy. And Lebanon in 1979, when things were still unsettled, had a rating of 75, compared to 64 for Syria, and 63 for Jordan, and 35 for Saudi Arabia. For comparison, in the same period, Israel's was 92, Ours was 96 and Japan's was 99. Nobody's got 100. Literacy in Lebanon is 68%, which is very high for the Arab world. Compares to 88% in Israel and 15% in Saudi Arabia. They've got an infant mortality rate of 45, which is pretty high. It's about double that of Washington, D.C., which is 26 today, I think. Israel's is 16, Saudi Arabia's is 118. The system worked because the rivalries between these sects and this crazy confessional division of powers prevented any single group from taking over the country and dominating. There was always a check, a religious check and balance working. The result was often more license than liberty, but the country functioned. There were great gaps, great differences in wealth and poverty in this country, but it was an amazingly prosperous place. Today, land in downtown Beirut is still selling for more than land in downtown New York City. Throughout the Civil War, the Lebanese made money. They ran 2 airlines without any government subsidy, unlike most non-American airlines, and they all declared profit. In the middle of this, Middle East Airlines wanted to buy some Boeings, and they had the money to do it. They have shown great facility for making money. One wished they had the same facility for doing politics in a pragmatic way. We used to say, however, that this was all held together by the tension between these groups. It was like an arch, the stones of which are held together by the tension between themselves. And this is a very strong structure until you jiggle the foundation, at which point, when the stones spring apart, suddenly they drop down. What happened? This happens when you have an earthquake. You see these arch structures all over Lebanon, for instance, that fell in the earthquake of 1956 or 57. The earthquake for the political structure came in 1970 with the entry of the armed Palestinians who had been expelled from Jordan. And it was too much for this structure to bear. It was too much for a number of reasons, but 2 in particular. One, that the Palestinians constituted a state within a state which was not controlled by the government, and they were doing things that were provoking Israeli reaction, which the rest of the Lebanese were paying for. And the second was a confessional one. Most of these people were Muslim. To admit them into the body politic would mean changing this fictional 6-to-5 ratio. 6-to-5 ratio means that the parliament must always be composed of a multiple of 11 members. You've got to have 99 or 33 or 66 members in the parliament so that you can have 6 Christians for every Muslim. Well, if you vote in the Palestinians, you have to change that. So the state began coming apart. The fatal flaw was that this tribal spirit, the failure to develop a Lebanese national consciousness. People were loyal to their families, not to the state. They were loyal to their sect. The army was divided. The army could not be used against the Palestinians because the Muslims in the army would not shoot the Muslim Palestinians. The army cannot be used against the Phalange because the Christians in the army will not shoot against the Phalange. This lack of national consciousness was complicated by the fact that everybody else was dumping on Lebanon. The other Arabs, the Palestinians, the Israelis. Nobody was respecting Lebanese sovereignty. The civil war which broke out was inevitable in this situation. The origins are still a question of dispute, but it was a very complex struggle in which all the civilized restraints evaporated. People began killing each other simply because they were of the other sect. Christians were killing as many Muslims as Muslims were killing Christians. And at this point, you must remember that the Christians are Arabs as well as the Muslims. This raises, of course, a question as to what is an Arab? A question that's sometimes very difficult to answer. The answer we used to give is, well, was when people say they're Arabs, they must be Arabs. Well, the Maronites kept saying, we're not Arabs, we're Phoenicians. But they're all a great mixture of people descended from the Canaanites and other conquerors and possessors of this territory. And you cannot, you and I, looking at them, cannot tell the Maronite from the Sunni by any racial indices that are obvious to us. They may be obvious to Lebanese, but not to us. So it's Arab killing Arab, and it's Christian killing Muslim, and Muslim killing Christian. The fighting subsided with the intervention of the Syrians in 1976, the imposition of an Arab peacekeeping force. A force which was sent in to restore order, and which restored a certain amount of it in the area between Beirut and Damascus, but which never pacified the southern part of the country. I'll come back to that. The truce, the ceasefire held for about 2 years, and then it came apart in early 1978 because the Maronites were suspicious of the Syrian intentions. They were irritated by Syrian actions, and suddenly fighting broke out between them very dramatically, and the Syrian response was to bombard Beirut, and we had for about 8 months a series of increasingly terrible conflicts between Maronites and Syrians. Meanwhile, as I said earlier, southern Lebanon was unpacified. Southern Lebanon was unpacified for one reason, because among reasons, was that the Israelis would not let the Syrians go south of the Litani River. They would not let the peacekeeping force come to southern Lebanon. They said that strategically this was too dangerous to that northern finger of Israel, which is up parallel to this area, to the as far as the Litani, and they kept them out. So there was no possibility for the Syrians to restore peace. I can understand Israel's strategic concern, but at the same time, if you won't let anybody in there, you can't expect to have order. In 1978, we tried to send the Lebanese army down there, and the Israelis and Major Haddad frustrated that. They did not want either the Lebanese or the Syrians south of the Litani. They were more concerned with building a cordon sanitaire with Major Haddad, and there are differing opinions on whether Major Haddad is a renegade or a hero. It all depends on your point of view. But from the period after the entry of the Syrians, the Palestinians controlled the area between Haddad and Beirut. Lebanese government authority in this area was nil, and it was a permanent threat to stability. In the spring of 1978, the Israelis invaded after this Palestinian attack on a bus on the coastal highway. They went as far as the Litani River. The response from the UN was the creation of this UN force, which moved back in as the Israelis retired. But it was a very unsatisfactory arrangement because the Palestinians remained there. Palestinians were still not under control. In 1981, trouble started in the Bekaa, and this fighting was precipitated by Bashir Gemayel's trying to muscle in the town of Zahli, which is a Greek Catholic town. It has nothing to do with the Maronites, and he had no business being there. But the fighting erupted, the Syrians got involved, the Israelis got involved, we had the missiles in the Bekaa, and Habib went out and negotiated a ceasefire. Well, that ceasefire held. It was holding pretty well. I mean, there were a couple of incidents, but they're not really all that serious. But in the spring of 1982, the attempt on Shlomo Argos' life in Beirut was taken as justification for launching. What did I say?
Beirut.
No. London, I'm sorry. Shlomo Argos in London. Was taken as a justification for this Peace in Galilee operation, which eventually moved as far as Beirut. The announced purpose of this was to assure the security of northern Israel, the Galilee area, to establish a security zone in southern Lebanon, and to destroy the military power of the PLO. Reagan and Sharon not having really written their memoirs yet, one doesn't really know for sure what they had in mind. But it seems pretty evident, at least according to Israelis, that this should be seen in the context of the attempt they have been carrying on for about a year to destroy the PLO as a political force on the West Bank. The deportation of mayors, the attempt to throttle Birzeit University, the build-up of the Village League, and so forth, were all aimed, openly advertised, aimed at destroying the political force of the PLO. They destroy its force on the West Bank, they destroy its military capabilities in Lebanon, and then that means they can deal with the Arab population on the West Bank without worrying about the PLO. Well, uncounted civilian and military casualties later, what is the bottom line? I say uncounted because I tried to find out from the Department of State today how many people were killed and wounded in Lebanon in the summer. And nobody knows. The Israelis came out with a figure of 400. The Palestinians come up with a figure of 60,000. The Lebanese government has come up with a figure of 15,000. The man, I talked to the desk officer, he said, well, we say it's somewhere between 400,000 and 60,000. 400 or 60,000. Now, obviously, somewhere in between. But a lot of civilians were killed. The argument has been made by people like Elmo Zumwalt that it was a great victory for the United States handed to us by the Israelis, that the area governments are free of a burden that had long oppressed them, that Lebanon had a chance for a new start, that Israel has security, that Soviet equipment has been shown to be inferior because the Israelis knocked out the T-72 tank and the SAM-8 missiles. It created new opportunities for peace and stability, and the U.S. should not look this gift horse in the mouth. I think that's an argument sincerely and conscientiously made. Now, what is the obverse of this? What did it produce in tangible terms? Now, first of all, I'm going to ignore the argument about whether or not the end justifies the means. Whether the truly horrifying casualties of this war in Sabra and Shatila and the brutalization of the Israelis which has occurred are justified under any circumstances. And they can be justified in our minds, most of us. We can be comfortable with this only if we depersonalize. If we detract from the Palestinians the quality of human beings. If we see them as abstractions, and those people over there, the other people. We can imagine the reaction if the tables had been turned, and if it was the Palestinians who were somehow going to establish order in Israel, and we had an equivalent number of Israeli casualties. People would be pretty upset. What did it produce in tangible terms? Clearly it was a military success. The military power of the PLO was destroyed in Lebanon. The Lebanese were given a new chance to put things together. And the Lebanese reaction to this, many of them, I'm sure, are happy that the Israelis did this to the Palestinians. And they would like to forget the Palestinians themselves because they were tired of their presence. I hope the Lebanese will succeed in putting things together. I keep getting different signals depending on whom I talk to, but I am fairly optimistic that there will be a new Lebanon. Another tangible contribution, it seems to me, is that a very healthy debate over Israeli policies has been started both in Israel and in the United States. To me, the most positive single result of this was it made President Reagan mad enough to stand up on his own hind feet and declare an independent policy on the 1st of September. Whether he will stay the course, I don't know. The speech of September 1 was great. but it should have been made 15 years ago. If it had been made by LBJ in 1967 or Nixon in 1969, thousands of lives and billions of dollars would have been saved. Forgetting about that, because these things come only in their time. For the first time, we have the possibility of a stable peace in the Middle East. It will require concessions that Israel will not willingly make. The price of peace in the final analysis, and must be confronted squarely, is going to be the evacuation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan. Is a heavy price. And for the Israeli who has to live with this requires an act of faith that is superhuman. But the question is, what are the alternatives that he doesn't do? The alternative is to live surrounded by perpetual hostility. There will not be another Sudan. But this peace, the prospect for peace is now opened by the Reagan Declaration. It really hasn't got anything to do with the operation in Lebanon. Lebanon simply spurred Reagan into doing something instead of sitting back and waiting as he had ever since his election. As for the argument that the invasion has somehow strengthened our position in the Arab world, I refer you to an interesting article by Tom Friedman in yesterday's New York Times. He's been around to various Arab countries talking to them, and I think it's clear that Arab attitudes towards us have not improved as a result of this, but have deteriorated. The point is that while people may stand up and salute while your tank passes by, it's a relationship based on fear is inherently unhealthy. And no matter how well-intentioned the Israelis are, when they are there in military force and in military occupation, the relationship cannot be one other than fear. No one likes to have it pointed out that he has been defeated and that he is defenseless, that he is weak. And that's how the Arabs find themselves today, and they will react. Finally, as to the defeat of Soviet arms, it's true that Soviet equipment in the hands of the Arabs is not nearly as effective as American equipment in the hands of the Brits. This is not news. We've known this for a long time. David and I had very close exposure to that in Cairo in 1967. Zumwalt is happy about the reorganization this is going to force the Soviets to make of their forces in Eastern Europe. Well, this seems to be overlooked the fact that the Soviets had the time to make that overhaul, to reorganize themselves, that they had a chance to test their equipment in battle at relatively minor cost to themselves, and that they now know its weaknesses and have a chance to correct it. Whether they'll have the sense to correct it is something else. Again, but at least they have gotten the opportunity. It's a little bit like the Spanish Civil War. All of our armed forces like to test their equipment under circumstances like this. And now they've just had their new, what shall we say, advanced Fort Meade. The Soviets have also engaged in a massive airlift, a massive lift of arms to Syria since then. I read a paper the other day that said the Syrians are spending something like $8 to $9 billion worth of money on arms this year, which is a truly horrifying figure. In other words, the ante has been up. As for the PLO, although it's true that its military strength in Lebanon has been destroyed, there's really nothing permanent about it except the denial of Lebanese bases. And that's the essential thing that the Israelis accomplished. And that is very important, that the PLO not be allowed to come back and operate in Lebanon. But this does not mean that they will not be able to produce young men who will train to fight Israel one day. Over against that, the PLO is credited by the other Arabs as having put up a very good fight. They held off the Israelis longer than anybody else, even though everybody knows they were disorganized and were not a regular army. Arafat gained political stature by his behavior during all of this, and the chances of Israel finding itself face-to-face with him across the conference table someday, I think, are probably greater as a result of last summer than lesser. The resort to force always always unleashes forces which are uncontrollable and unpredictable. He who lives by the sword, etc. The military mind tends to overlook the sequel, which becomes the problem of the diplomat and the politician. The military man is irritated when his accomplishment does not receive the praise he expected, but few military heroes have to pay the bill. It's the populace which has to pay it. And I feel that Bacon today must feel very much like the sorcerer's apprentice, because he has released forces he never imagined would react as they did. The tragedy of Lebanon is the responsibility of many people, not least of whom are the Lebanese. The question now before us is whether we have the will to help them restore their dignity and whether the rest of the world will let them live in peace. Thank you.
Ambassador Parker has been good enough to agree to answer questions until 7 o'clock.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Parker, if I understand you correctly, you said you're convinced that the price of peace will be the evacuation of the West Bank. Now, how can one, particularly the United States or Israel, have reasonable assurances that this will bring us peace or something close to it?
Well, I think you put your finger. The question was, how can Israel or the United States? So I had said that I thought giving up the West Bank and Gaza were the price of peace. And how could Israel and the United States have any confidence that Israel would get real peace if it did this? Well, that seems to me to be the question. As I never tire of telling people, it's the Israelis who are going to have to live with this. And it's the Israelis who've got to be convinced that what they're going to get for withdrawal is worth more than what they're going to get by staying. And until there is a credible Arab commitment to peace, I cannot see any Israeli government agreeing to anything like that.
But haven't the Israelis made the argument that they already paid the price of Camp David by giving Egypt what they gave Egypt?
Well, the evacuation of, now this is Shamir's point to, well, we've already evacuated 90% of the territory we occupied, and we're going to keep the rest. Well, the Camp David agreement was not confined to Sinai. There was obviously a misunderstanding between Begin and Sadat on one hand and Carter on the other as to what was going to transpire in the West Bank. At least that's the most charitable interpretation one can put on it. But the idea that there had to be some arrangement which the Palestinians could accept for the West Bank was something that was understood throughout the negotiations, at least on our side. The problem is the formulation that Begin used about autonomy. The autonomy that he has proposed for these people means that they will have the power to vote taxes for roads and sewers, but they will not control the water that goes into them. They will pay the taxes for the schools, but they will not control what's taught in the schools. The Israelis will decide what the textbooks will be. Well, this is a sort of a Bantustan arrangement that the Palestinians simply not going to accept. Now, it may be that Israel has no alternative, but it has to look down the road and see what happens if it continues in the present path. Yes, sir.
The suggestions that you have made that Israel is going to be required to have a great deal of faith sound something very much like homogenized white bread based on the realities of the situation in the Mideast now. As you as a former diplomat have not suggested at this point that the United States be a guarantor of the so-called idealistic peace that would come if Israel decided to give up the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And as a former ambassador, you have not suggested that the American government and its military have been a little less than faithful with those other allies whom they have guaranteed peace. I would think that, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, Israel would be pissing in the wind if they did what you suggested.
Well, I understand your reaction.
Mr. Ambassador,
I'm not.
he meant urinating.
Well, that's good. I've got to have that explanation. The question is put. I think it goes right to the heart of it. I don't think that an American guarantee. I mean, the American government is certainly prepared to guarantee it. I don't think the Israelis have any confidence in an American guarantee, and I understand that. The arrangement is going to have to be one between Israel and its neighbors. And they're going to have to be satisfied between themselves that they can live in peace. If they cannot, we have perpetual hostility, and where does it end? I mean, if we're talking about pissing in the wind, I would say you're farting in a whirlwind.
That peace or something like peace in Lebanon itself would be gained by the withdrawal of foreign forces. Now, my question is, wouldn't the withdrawal of foreign forces from Lebanon also have to be accompanied with the disarming of militias within Lebanon itself, the establishment of a strong central Lebanese government, or you're going to have a return to civil war? The Syrians, Israelis, or the PLO lead?
Well, certainly, any withdrawal is going to have to be something very carefully worked out, and there's going to have to be some arrangement to maintain security in the areas that the various forces evacuate. This is a very big and very complex question, but I don't think it's beyond our human capability to work out something in terms of international forces that will, and some arrangement about southern Lebanon that will give Israel some assurance that its security can be maintained. But this is, I mean, it can't be done tomorrow. No, and nobody's talking in terms of a simple withdrawal of the forces. This is something that everybody understands must be done in the context of the imposition of another authority to take over. Amin Gemayel, the president, is suggesting an international force to do this. We have not been very enthusiastic about that, but I think that this is probably where eventually we're going to come out if we really want to arrange the evacuation. The Israelis are not going to evacuate southern Lebanon and leave a vacuum. Yes, sir, over there. What is our direct interest in Lebanon? It's it's another good question. We don't have much of a stake in Lebanon. We haven't got any real estate there, or any resources we're interested in. Militarily, strategically, it's not something that's important to us. We couldn't ever use that territory for anything. We have certain ties of sentiment to a rather sizable Lebanese American community. Lebanon has been a moderate state, and we're interested in seeing moderate states survive. Our principal interest today, I think, is seeing Lebanon as a threat to the stability of the area. And that if we do not stabilize Lebanon, sooner or later, we're going to have another round in the Arab-Israel war. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, you talked about the brutalization of the Israeli army. Not one word has been printed in the press, or hardly at all. Hundreds of letters, hundreds of articles pointing out, blaming the Israeli army for the massacre in the PLO camps. Why the new president, Gemayel, has said the Israelis were responsible. Not a word is said about the real murderers, the hundreds of Falungists who went in there, committed the murders. They are, by our terms of law, the responsible murderers in the first place. The others were possibly accomplices. That's being examined now by the Israeli government. Now, how can you say that the Israeli army has been brutalized? What about the Lebanese?
Well, I was referring to perceptions of Israeli perceptions as reported in the press and various articles I read in the past few months. I did not mean to imply that they were in any way involved in the massacre in Shetel and Sabra, but after all, they went in with the understanding that they were going to maintain order. We gave certain commitments to the Palestinians, Habib did, that if they would withdraw their troops, their people would be protected. We trusted the Israelis to do this. We really have to wait to see the full outcome of these hearings, but certainly the Israeli military bear a heavy burden of negligence in this case. The idea that they would have let the Phalange go into this camp 2 or 3 days after the assassination of Bashir Gemayel, their beloved hero, and not expect them to take revenge is something that I find very difficult to understand. I would not for a minute think this was deliberate on their part, but I think that they, like our leaders at Pearl Harbor, they should have had more sense. And I'm surprised that they didn't. Yes?
But that does hardly amount to brutalization of the Israelis as a nation. And after all, 400,000 out of a nation of 3 million did demonstrate. We didn't have a single demonstration that large in America during the entire Vietnamese broiled.
Well, I'm saying a great many Israelis are concerned about it. I mean, the people in these soldiers and officers in the Israeli army are concerned about it, about what is involved by the bombing of refugee camps in cities to get at the PLO, the hundreds and thousands of civilian casualties. I was not referring to Sabra and Shatila when I said that. Now, I have not been to Israel since then. Now, all I can judge by is what I've heard from individual Israelis who've spoken in these terms, who've been very upset by what they have found themselves or their brothers doing. Yes, sir.
Yes, if Israelis keep the same attitudes that others seem to maintain and refuse to make any concessions to the West Bank, and therefore guarantee that there's going to be continued hostilities between the Israelis and the Arabs, is it in the U.S. best interest to support the Israelis the way we have in the past, concerning, especially in view of the strategic and the strategic assets of the Arab countries opposed to a U.S. foreign policy? In other words, is it in our best interest of the Israelis to have the present course to maintain the same close relationship we've had with them for the past 30 years?
Well, I don't think it's in our own best interest. But this is it's a complex decision that's got to be made. I don't think we can expect Israel to take a decision which it thinks is contrary to its national interest. And if it refuses to give up the West Bank and chooses to continue in possession of that territory, questions about our relationship inevitably are going to arise. But how we deal with this, I don't know. It's a very difficult question, yes.
You mentioned that Mr. Reagan's speech should have been given 15 years ago or whatever. Isn't it true, however, that for the effectiveness of the speech, and it was an effective one, was the difference perhaps between Phase 1 and Phase 2? Before the Israelis went into Lebanon, even with the very faint-hearted Fahad plan, was rejected by the majority of the Arabs. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and I think you would agree, the weakening of the PLO and the weakening of Syria, we began to move to an Arab consensus that perhaps we have to deal and live in peace, however limited, with the Israelis. Now, is it not true that one of the goals of Reagan's speech at that time was to influence the Fez conference?
Yeah, well, I would certainly the military weakness of the Arabs demonstrated last summer is a factor in their current attitude on this question. But I would argue that the Reagan speech had more of an impact than the military defeat. the military defeat is essentially a negative consideration as far as they're concerned, and they haven't really got anything more to lose by continuing to be negative. The Reagan speech offered them some positive possibilities, and they responded to that. Until we get inside the minds of the people that said it, we're not really going to know. I've got some. Yes, sir. Way down at the end.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I thought we turned your back to us. And we have finished our hands full, and I'm glad we finally decided to look over here. I have two-pronged questions. One, there is a school of thought on both sides of the Atlantic that seems to feel that the Israelis have won a temporary and short-term military victory in Lebanon, and that the PLO has won a long-term diplomatic and public relations victory. That is from one. If you answer that, I can give you from two. Why do
you agree with that?
How do you react to that?
Do I accept that proposition?
Well, I'm asking you, how do you react to that?
What do I add to that?
How do you react?
Well, how do I react to that?
Yes,
Sorry.
please.
I don't hear very well, you see.
Oh, let me come here.
Well, that's that's a little bit oversimplified, frankly. I think the Israelis won more than a temporary military victory. I think they've demonstrated pretty clearly that there really isn't anybody who's able to stand up to them, if there's any doubt about that. And I think that's going to last for quite a while. As to the second proposition, Arafat, as I said, emerged with perhaps greater respectability out of this, but he's in something of a hole today, and he's going to have a hard time getting out of it. I mean, he is in disarray, and he's not suddenly catapulted into a position of great strategic influence.
My second prong question is this. There is a consensus among scholars and historians and diplomats that what happened in Lebanon under Israeli gun has tended very effectively to radicalize moderate Arab states and will make it impossible for them to make peace with Israel. How do you react to that?
Well, that's, in essence, I would say, again, somewhat oversimplified, the thesis that Tom Friedman was postulating yesterday in the New York Times. That it's made it, there will inevitably be a radicalization after this very stunning defeat. On the other hand, I would argue that at this point, we do have an opportunity for peace. That the Arabs are in a state of disarray. That if we can be sufficiently positive, there is a possibility today that was not there a year ago, at the time of the first phase, to move ahead towards peace. I don't think the score is totally negative. Yes, sir.
Mr. Master, I think we all recall when the PLOs were forced to leave the territory of Western Beirut. For some strange reason, they were all showing the peace sign. Here is a group of anarchists under the pressure of the Israelis armed forces and the continuous barrage. They found it somehow necessary to leave before they get all knocked out completely. As I can recall, when Sir Winston Churchill used that, he had altogether different ideas in his mind. So it seems to me a group of people who were definitely defeated, and it was obvious to the observers on television whether they were for Muslims or for Christians, Lebanese, that
these people had to leave. They had no intention to leave. They just were forced to leave. And yet they were all showing the visa and all this sort of thing. And we were told about a figure of about 6,000 PLOs left. I suppose the figures in this country is extremely important. The statistical data, you know, a lot of us live on the figures, including some of members of my own profession in medicine. They have to have figures to prove everything. Now, today, we are told approximately about 14,000 additional PLOs are left over in Lebanon. In other words, for each one PLO left, 2 or 3 hid themselves in the basement. So, really, it seems to me this big ceremonial affair is the major problem of the PLO's accumulation and creation of difficulty in Lebanon. That close to the Israeli border is not really over. Now, the United States got together with Italy and France. They all contributed a certain number of soldiers, money, and appropriation and whatnot to keep the situation in order before everything just start going into the flame again. Now, my question is, realizing the state of Lebanon today, how weak the government is, how unrepresentative the government is, the problem among different sectors, the Muslims hating some other section of the Muslims, some flanges dislike some other member of flanges, all these are against each other, Christians are just hating the Muslims. It seems to me there's a tremendous amount of disarray, and the government is so unrepresentative and weak. What are the chances of creating a stable government in Beirut? Some limited degree of prospect of peace will be felt or dreamed. How long the United States, Italian, and French forces are going to be there, and are they really working towards that goal?
Well, I don't think the forces that are there today are accomplishing anything much other than sort of psychological window dressing in terms of restoring order. If international forces are going to do it, there are going to have to be a lot more of them on the ground, and they're actually going to have to police the place. And this is what I personally think we're eventually going to be reduced to, because all of the problems you outlined are there. As to why the PLO made the V sign when they left, you'll recall that Churchill began doing this in the darkest days of World War II. It was not when Britain was triumphant. It was a sign to people, you know, we haven't given up the fight. After all, there wasn't much else they could do, was there?
Yes, you use the term Palestinian and PLO interchangeably.
Yeah.
Now, it bothers me, and I'm just wondering, it seems to me that Israel will not make peace with PLO. There is a possibility that they will talk to Palestinians. Now, are they all under one umbrella, or are there two factions involved here?
Well, the PLO is an umbrella organization. PLO represents a rather wide spectrum of Palestinian opinion, from fairly conservative doctors and businessmen on one hand to rather radical Marxist terrorists like George Bush on the other. Arafat has been able to stay on the top of this because he has been very agile, moving back and forth. But there are limits on how far he can go. The PLO is the only organization at this point that can have much claim to represent the Palestinians. However much we may dislike the idea, it is as representative of the Palestinians as, say, the National Liberation Front was of the Algerians in the war with the French. There were a lot of Algerians who didn't agree with that. A lot of Palestinians who don't agree with the PLO. But the Village League, this Israeli-sponsored organization, has not gotten off the ground because, because it's identified with the occupier. If there were a real prospect today, if tomorrow Begin got out of bed and said we're going to give you a Palestinian state on the East Bank, on the West Bank, I think that would be the end of the PLO. The only question is that you come not representing the PLO. somehow, some way, this is something that has to be gotten around. But there is at this point no other organization that can really speak for them. Yes.
Do you see the only solution for peace is to give up the West Bank?
Well, this is my view, and others can question it. But if we get some other arrangement, I'd be willing to support it. But at this point, this is the only one that I see that's going to work. And I'm not guaranteeing it will work. Yes, ma'am.
I don't see how you can expect Israel at this point in the way things are to give independence to the West Bank, or give up the West Bank. After all, even though Arafat and the PLO has been defeated, they have not, up until now, recognized the state of Israel. Another thing that strikes me as odd is Jordan and Saudi Arabia don't seem to be eager to have a West Bank. And also, before Israel occupied the West Bank, what did the Arabs want before then? So it seems to me that what the Palestinians really, or what Arafat and the PLO really want, is to replace this whole state of Israel.
Well, that certainly was the original premise of the Palestine National Covenant. And the willingness to settle for a state on the West Bank represents an evolution in Palestinian thinking. They are prepared to live in peace with Israel in exchange for
They don't
this. Now,
say that.
well, they haven't said it as clearly and unequivocally as they've got to say it. It's impossible for Israel to consider giving up this territory in the absence of a credible commitment to recognize Israel and live in peace with it. And if that credible commitment is not forthcoming, I wouldn't blame the Israelis for 5 minutes for not moving. If it does come forward, I think that they're going to be making a mistake not to take it. Yes, ma'am.
What has happened to David Dodge?
What has happened to David Dodge? David Dodge was the acting president of the American University of Beirut, who was kidnapped last summer by some Iranians. And this is a bizarre affair that apparently has nothing to do with the Palestinians or anything else in Lebanon.
As a relief, yes. What has happened to David Dodge?
He is, whether David Dodge is still alive, I do not know.
The United States government doesn't know?
Does not, at this point, we hope he's still alive. People are deliberately not saying anything about it. Because they're hoping that he's still alive and that we may be able to negotiate his release. But that's all I can tell you. Yes, sir. Yes.
Just to take one of your statements to extend this a little bit. Assuming that it takes two to tango, Israel should give up the West Bank. There's some credible response from the Arabs, and our illustrious president has come out with a sort of a plan to do that. Besides the types of pressure we put on Israel, what types of pressure should we be putting on the other side to have it report to some sort of credible partnership for the peace plan?
Well, I think the only real pressure we have with the Arabs at this point is the question of the fact that we have some influence with Israel. If they will come forward with something credible, we will try to move the Israelis to come forward to meet them. I don't think anything else we can do now. And this, again, is a question of their having confidence in us, and I think they're not going to be left in the lurch if they do it. This is an elaborate minuet that's going on. I hope it comes to an end soon. Yes?
So if you can comment on in terms of scale and trust and things like that, the military actions by the Israelis against the Arabs.
Speak up.
You're asking, talking about trust and confidence, will I comment on the Israeli action against the Iraqi reactor in Baghdad? Well, this of course is not the sort of operation that is designed to create confidence in one's people and nations. They overflew both Saudi and Jordanian territory to do this. and the fact that they could do it, and the Saudis and the Jordanians didn't even know they were there until after they'd gone, and all of this is not the sort of thing that really creates a great deal of confidence. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, what do you think will happen to the Palestinians in Lebanon once Israel leaves and once the Syrians?
Well, you may be referring to this article in the Israeli paper Ma'ariv yesterday.